So thank you for having me here and giving me the opportunity to present our work on the connection between media representations, threat perceptions, and what we call the seeds of majority radicalization. So what I'm going to present here is a series of 3 studies. 2 of them are already mentioned in the abstract, but we just conducted a follow-up study on study 2, which was a pre-registered experiment, and I'm happy to present these data here too. The first study I'm going to present, I will show that later. A common theme of all the studies that I'm going to present here is the connection between threat perceptions and migration-related, immigration-related attitudes, and the moderating role of media representation in that relationship. So that is basically the focus for all of the studies. The first study, I have to say that, has already been published in Political Psychology this year, and my collaborators here were Annette Roman, Agostino Mazzotta Birtesim, and Maria Luisa Barberino, all from my home university, the University of Hagen. And so I will rush a little bit through this first study to have more time to elaborate the non-published work. So this study focused on the media representations in the context of the Ebola outbreak in 2014 and 15. And I know you were all aware of the Ebola outbreak in that point in time that hit specifically Western African countries. And there were also some single infections in Western European and also North American countries. But the single infection actually sparked an extensive debate in those countries about restrictive health policies. I think there were governors debating about mandatory quarantining in the US, and that discussion, that debate has also been followed up in Germany and other Western European countries. And an interesting issue that was related to that debate, of course, were media representations about Ebola disease as a whole. So one theoretical account that we took to, or were interested in pursuing with regard to the analysis of media representation was social representation theory, and we draw here from research on social representations on diseases. And what, at least in the public, is commonly widely ignored is that diseases are not just biomedical facts, but they are also social cultural products, or the social representation, how actually diseases are construed in a specific historic, socially, or cultural context is largely influenced by social and psychological factors. And well, social representation theory persists that people in a given society or collective generate widely shared beliefs about, for example, diseases here, by integrating all different kinds of knowledge that might be medical knowledge, but that's also cultural wisdoms, religious beliefs, and so on and so on. And further research also suggests that these social representations of diseases, but social representations in general, of course have or fulfill several functions for the individual. For example, communicating is easier if we all agree upon what we have to communicate if we encounter something new, but also political functions. And these political functions, this was one idea that we were pursuing here, that also in the context of Ebola, the social representation or the media representation, because mass media play a significant role in actually creating these social representation, that these representation of Ebola disease have also some political function and political consequences, even though they, at the very surface, maybe are more hidden and not very obvious. So when we started to look at Western media representation of Ebola disease, there was little research out there. There was one qualitative interview study with readers of British tabloid newspapers, and also a media analysis of the content of these newspaper articles of Ebola. That was the Ebola outbreak in 1997 in Zaire. And the conclusion of this analysis basically is that there is the strong emphasis on the otherness of African culture. So Ebola and the origins of Ebola are traced back to primitive cultural practices, specifically eating bushmeat. And this eating bushmeat will probably create in any of you a certain image. And when we started our research, we also did a media analysis. And just to show you some pictures, these were pictures that were broadcasted by several social web media, or also television and also print media, like showing these crowded African markets and tracing back the origins of Ebola to eating bushmeat, specifically, what is it called again? Not fruit bats, but flying foxes. Flying foxes, and images from a Westerner perspective, which look really disturbing. Like these roasted flying foxes, a little bit vampire-like looking. And so we also did an analysis qualitatively of, for example, headlines in the most prominent news portals in the web, and also the most renowned publications of newspapers, for example, the Frankfurter Allgemeine in Germany or the Süddeutsche Zeitung. And just to give you some examples how actually Ebola was represented and linked to African primitive cultures, cultural practices is, for example, the Frankfurter Allgemeine had a headline, "You cannot eat flying foxes anymore." So there was like with the index, no, no, no. Or one does not play with monkeys. Also Süddeutsche Zeitung. And in other countries, the UK and the US, it was not better, sometimes even worse. For example, Newsweek had like headlines, well, I can't read it from here, but is smuggling bushmeat into the country, does that transmit Ebola to the United States or something? And the interesting thing is, from a medical perspective, this origin of the disease is totally contested. And specifically, later medical research showed that first, from a medical point of view, the transmission of Ebola is from people to people and not from bushmeat to people. That's the first thing. And also, the whole story of eating bushmeat has been severely contested. So the patient 0 was a young boy who played with fruit bats and was bitten by fruit bats. And that is now the official medical objective truth. But the social truth transmitted in the social representation of the disease was a totally different story. And of course, as social psychologists, we were interested why that would be the case and what the consequences of that story is. So from a social representation point of view, social representations have to fulfill or have some certain qualities to be actually accepted. And one is that they have the knowledge that is captured in that social representation has to be anchored in pre-existing cultural knowledge. And obviously, the information that Ebola is a disease that is, or that origins in primitive cultural practices has clear linkages to, one can say, post-colonial or even colonial stereotypes about Africans as a whole, Africans as primitive, wild, and potentially scary. I think these images of the flying foxes have a very scary potential too. And so these social representations, they fulfill this quality of anchoring it in pre-existing knowledge. And the images also provide some sort of objectification. So transmittable disease is a complex phenomenon, and social representation, one function of social representation is to narrow complexity down to make it easier to handle. And this is also fulfilled by these images of, well, the transmission by flying foxes and the markets where there are smoked flying foxes are being sold. One consequence of that is, of course, that the threat is not only the disease, but it is African culture. So the primitiveness of African culture, I mean the whole generalization hurts my ears when I say that, but it's what is conveyed by these representations. So when we were thinking about these two functions, we were also thinking about the political functions that such social representations might have. And these representations of African culture, they have historical roots, but they also fall into a time of a constant influx of migration from African countries to European countries or Western countries. And so our idea is that one, political functions of these representations is actually to serve as yet another excuse for exclusionary migration policies. And that is basically the idea what we pursued in our research. So what we investigated is two levels or two different kinds of threats, how they are related to the restrictive health policies that are debated or support to restrictive health policies that were debated in public discussions or political discussions in reaction to Ebola. And one was the more physical or maybe realistic threat of actually getting an infection, Ebola infection. So to what extent did people actually believe that they or someone who's close to them could actually get an infection by Ebola? And the more symbolic threat posed by African immigrants. So symbolic threat posed by African immigrants and their cultural differences to the Western or here specifically German culture. And our first prediction was that we expected that in this particular context of immigration, specifically from African countries to Germany and other Western European countries, symbolic threat would account for more variance in support of restrictive health policy support than would actually the physical or realistic threat variable. We also were interested in how actually the belief in these social representations would moderate the relationship, so to speak, not only moderate but intensify the effect of symbolic threat on support for restrictive health policy. And we were also interested in yet another relationship. I won't go into detail too much in this presentation here, but how that is related to also other dispositional variables, for example, right-wing authoritarianism. And basically, we expected a mediation or moderated mediation model I'm showing right here. So we expected that more dispositional variables would actually translate into more specific forms of threat. So we investigated the role of right-wing authoritarianism, and this is personal perceived vulnerability of disease. That is a measure introduced by Mark Schaller and others into the literature, which captures the perceived individual risk of attracting any disease. That should translate more into the perceived threat of catching Ebola or someone near to one. Right-wing authoritarianism should translate into symbolic threat. and then we expected that both would contribute to support of restrictive health policies, but we expected a stronger effect of symbolic threat in comparison to Ebola threat. And we additionally expected that to the extent that people would actually believe what the media says, and to measure that we had like actual factual statements of media publications on Ebola, that would further intensify the effect of symbolic threat. So I said I will rush a little bit through the method section here. So we had a diverse sample, mean age 36 years, 218 participants, mostly of them employed in various fields. And the data collection took place at 2 different points in time. So we first measured dispositional variables, then we had a time lag, and then we measured symbolic threat, Ebola threat, and personal beliefs regarding the acceptance of the truth, so to speak, of the media representation of Ebola. And we had 2 different criterion measures. One was support for mandatory quarantining of newly incoming immigrants from Africa, all of them, all Africans who would come in to Germany, and also support for closing the German borders. And basically what we find is support for our prediction that is a structural equation model showing the predicted relationships. What is more important with regard to our first hypothesis is the huge difference between the variance explained by symbolic threat on the one hand and a realistic or physical threat on the other hand, which was multiple times higher for symbolic threat, and also the interactions with the personal beliefs concerning the representation of Ebola. So the effect of symbolic threat, or the relation here of symbolic threat with restrictive health policies, was intensified as predicted the more people would actually, or the participants would actually believe that these origins located in the differences in African cultures were actually true. So, and that was also true for the other variable, closing borders. So to sum up, I think we have clear evidence that with regard to the relative comparison of the 2 different forms of threat, symbolic threat was the driving force here. Also, we have evidence for this interaction with the media representation. And just recall that we took really statements out of existing articles about Ebola, referring to the primitive practices of, for example, eating bushmeat. And also, as again, a minor point here, through this process, also the more dispositional variable actually translated into right-wing authoritarianism, translated into the support for restrictive health policies, and this impact was also intensified via the interaction with symbolic threat in media. Okay, so the studies I'm going to talk right now, they tap a totally different context, and that is the context of the Cologne New Year's Eve assaults. I have to say here at the very beginning, just to give some statistical information, that Germany in 2015 accepted over 1 million refugees coming predominantly from the Middle East. And Germany is in Europe the country that accepts most of the refugees. And the Chancellor Merkel had a very welcoming attitude and received much applause for that, but not consensus within the German country. So at the point, well, at the end of the year, whereas at the beginning, really that welcoming attitude and this huge rise of, for example, volunteerism. We've never seen such a rise in volunteerism, cross-group volunteerism in the country. At the end of the year, there was a deep polarization of the German society. There was a rise in attacks against asylum seeker homes. There was a rise in election turnouts for right-wing parties. So at that point in time, at the end of the year, the country was basically split in many different migration-related attitudes, and it still is. Then the Cologne New Year's Eve, most of you will know what happened. So there is a place in Cologne next to the central station, which is typically used for gathering during the New Year's Eve celebration, a public place. At that year, 2015, there were many women sexually assaulted. There were robberies, there were thefts, and the perpetrators reported by the police were men allegedly with a North African Arabic cultural background, and it was a group of about 1,000 people, allegedly mostly men, gathering at that place. And at that point in time, immediately after after New Year's Eve, so at the beginning of 2016, well, it was rather unclear what actually happened. So there were very different reports. It was sort of an ambiguous situation. It was very clear that something happened, and in the period of the next month, there were over 1,000 complaints concerning sexual assaults were filed. But the exact dynamics, what actually happened, who the perpetrators are, whether it was like organized criminality of a group of a few, if it was mostly men from Morocco or Algeria who were already in the country, or whether it were newly incoming asylum seekers, and so on and so on. That was really very, very unclear. Despite these ambiguities and uncertainties, the media representation at that point in time presented, after, I think, at least latest at 9 days, a very clear-cut picture of what actually was going on there. And the reason why we were interested in studying what actually these media representation, how these media representation also related again to perceptions of threat, was that this situation was so ambiguous in that point in time, so that there was a potential that people could vary in the degree that they would actually believe what was being told in the media about the perpetrators and so on and so on. And so we could study how that would actually affect the relationship between perceived threat and something which is more really related to radicalization, radical attitudes. And so here we also draw on social representation theory, but also on Kruglanski's radicalization theory, because he and his associates make specific prediction concerning the content of the social representation. They call it ideology, but I would say there is this overlap to social representation and shared meaning of a situation. So first, radicalization is defined in the context of that theory, a movement to support or adopt radical means to address specific problems or goals, so non-normative means. And of course, radicalization is a complex process. Individual, group, and ideological or societal factors play a role. We are focusing here on these media representations. And the interesting thing here is, as I just said, the idea that, well, the representations, or there must be an ideology, and I think that this framing is part of a wider ideology, right-wing ideology, that presents an identification of the collective grievance, the attribution to the perpetrators or who are responsible, and the legitimization of the radical means. And I will briefly explore how we think actually that relates to the media representations. So what I'm showing here is media representation from two very respected media in Germany. One is the Süddeutsche Zeitung, which is a leading publication of the liberal spectrum, and the other one is a conservative, far-reaching news magazine, The Focus. Both publications have been published 9th of January, so within a time frame when even the police wasn't sure what actually happened. They knew that there was something. Yeah, thank you. They knew that there was something happening, but not exactly what. But what you can see here, the first picture, is the cover of the weekend edition of that Süddeutsche Zeitung. And, well, the subtitle said something, well, young Muslim can be relaxed in their interactions with regard to the opposite sex. All these situations are highly sexualized. So that is a statement, I have to shame on psychology, made by a psychologist that was cited to say that. The other cover says women accuse after the sex attacks by migrants. So all lumping together the migrants. Are we just tolerant or are we blind? So the reason why I'm showing these different covers is because they cover the whole political spectrum. So there is a form of consensus of a linkage between the Cologne assaults and Muslim culture. So Muslim culture as a whole, linking all or lumping all immigrants, of course, together, but specifically Muslim immigrants. So returning to the issue of the framing and the radicalizing frame, so there is the grievance, of course, sexual assaults on our women, so that is for sure. Then the supposed culprits, masses of Muslim men, and the arguments to justify the necessity of radical means. That is really interesting. One is, and that is consistent with Proglansky's reasoning, blaming the outgroup's unalterable essence or nature. So if there is no way to actually change it, then you are also right, or it is justified to actually do something which is not normative. But the other one is that blaming the political correctness of the system or the media was also a recurring argument in that whole discussion and also in the media coverage. So like the focus, are we too tolerant or simply blind? Political correctness, that is something that also occurred, of course, in the Trump campaign, but that is something where there has been no other way than radical means actually to express what is right to do because of the political correctness. So our main hypotheses were basically very similar to what I just showed in the other sample, in the other study. So we expected that symbolic threat would be a stronger predictor, explain more variance. Then again, we had a physical threat, namely perceived fear or threat of street crime. So if people would actually think that they themselves could become a victim of similar assaults in the near future. And we again expected that to the extent that people would accept the media representation, the symbolic threat effect would become even stronger. So again, we had a diverse sample. We sampled at the peak of the media coverage, so immediately in January to February, 468 non-Muslim participants, again a diverse sample. And we measured fear of street crime with an established measure, symbolic threat, again with an established measure. By the way, that's the Stefan symbolic threat measure. The moderator, again, we took statements from the media and asked if people would accept them, and I just read two of them. So the victim-perpetrator constellation, approximately 1,000 men assaulted women sexually on New Year's Eve. 1,000 men. Alleged the background, the perpetrators were mainly from North African or Arabic cultures, and the alleged political sensitivities, political correctness surrounding the perpetrators' ethnicity. For a long while, the media were hesitant to report on the events, to gloss over an inconvenient truth during the time of the refugee crisis. So these are all statements in major news publications. And our main criteria variable, radical attitudes. So we had items referring to trivialization of right-wing violence. We had items support for the arming of civilians to protect themselves against immigrants, and support for closing the German borders to all immigrants and foreigners. And what we see, again, symbolic threat accounted for a larger proportion, as did fear of street crime. Very similar picture than in the previous study. And then we had the predicted interaction. We also find some interaction with regard to fear of street crime by acceptance of the media representation, but that was weaker. It was significant, but let me show you the symbolic threat by acceptance interaction. So we have a steep increase with regard to the impact of symbolic threat, and the increase was not as steep with regard to fear of street crime. So to sum up, we have a very similar picture with regard to the time. I just want to go to the other study because here that is a correlational study, and what I didn't show you, not to gloss over it, is the correlational pattern. So we have, of course, high correlations between, for example, symbolic threat and media acceptance, which makes interpretations of these moderation effects a bit difficult, not implausible, but there could be other interpretations. And so we ran an experimental study to address these limitations. And so we had 2 time of measurements in that experimental study. At time 1, we measured again the predictor variables, fear of street crime and symbolic threat. And at time 2, we had an experimental manipulation where we actually exposed our participants in the experimental condition to a Wikipedia article, an actual Wikipedia article on the Cologne events, and which actually represents basically the same story, or tells the same story. I could elaborate more on that, how that actually with self-references is very awkward to read. But, and in the control condition, they read a neutral Wikipedia article. And did I miss anything? Yeah, and we had that pre-registered. The cover story was that we invited our participants for a study on personality and linguistic preferences in media use. So there was no mentioning at all throughout the whole study of the Cologne events. Again, a diverse sample of research participants. Cover story, all participants first received 1 Wikipedia article on New Year in Japan, and then the experimental manipulation, the experimental group, the Cologne events, and the other one about the city of Aachen. What you see, again, a huge difference with regard to symbolic threat and fear of street crime. And of course, also the expected interactions. So what you can see here is that symbolic threat has an impact in both conditions, but, and I've never seen that before, and I'm glad that we pre-registered that study. What you can see here in the experimental condition, we have a beta of 0.91 for the relationship between, and this is an actual prediction because we measured symbolic threat before, for symbolic threat and radical attitudes. And in the control condition, this relationship is also significant, but it is significantly higher in the experimental condition. So for fear of street crime, there were no significant interaction effects. And so the concluding comment to wrap things up, well, for all the 3 studies, social representation are no natural givens. So there's always the possibility of alternative interpretations. Social representation fulfills certain functions within the societal context. And for example, just as the origin of Ebola could have been attributed to nature rather than culture, the Cologne events could have been attributed to street gang criminality or group dynamics or whatsoever, rather than the cultural values of a group, the Muslim outgroup or immigrant group as a whole. Again, our research shows that to the extent that people actually adopt culturally essentializing interpretations of migration-related issues, that contributes to a radicalization by strengthening the impact of symbolic threat on the acceptance of radical positions or immigration-related attitudes. And for us, of course, as psychologists, it's one more reason to be specifically aware of these role of media representations. So I guess, I hope I'm still in time, and I thank you for your attention.